I'm going to be talking today about exactly why irreducible complexity is not seen as an issue for evolutionary biology. I'm going to be doing that by looking at the stinger of a bee. It is an irreducibly complex structure, as we'll see when we look at the definition of irreducible complexity that was put forth by Professor Michael Behe. Before that, I want to talk about just the origin of the theory of evolution. A lot of people associate it with Charles Darwin. He did not first come up with evolution in general, the idea that organisms are related to each other and that they diverged and became the things that they are today. That was actually a much older idea. In fact, you can find hints of it in ancient Greek philosophy. You can find hints of it in different cultures all around the world. And probably people have come up with pretty solid ideas about this in multiple cultures that just never made it to mainstream because they were cultures that were not in power and so on. It's a very simple idea that a lot of people have come to independently. And actually, when Darwin first published his book on it, he was encouraged to publish it because Alfred Russel Wallace had come up with the exact same idea and told him about it, and that pushed him into gear to try and get his stuff published. Evolution was being discussed in the 1800s by scientists already, but it wasn't being taken seriously because they didn't know how on earth you would have had this diversion that would happen. How would you get organisms to split and evolve down different pathways? What was causing this? There was no mechanism understood. And that's the big thing that Darwin added. So his book, published in 1859, he gave tons of evidence showing that common ancestry is a thing. Animals are related to each other. That was his main focus, was animals. And he also did a lot on plants in that book. So he really drove home that common ancestry is a thing to the point that it almost became undeniable for people who had access to museum specimens and could see this. He did it. That was one of the big goals of his book. The other big goal of his book was to propose a mechanism by which evolution can happen. And the mechanism he put forth is descent with modification acted upon by natural selection. So you have reproduction. We all know that organisms can reproduce. And if you have organisms that can reproduce, and if when they reproduce, the offspring are slightly different than each other and slightly different than the parents, if there is variation, heritable variation, some of those variants will happen to be better at surviving and reproducing within their specific environment. And so over time, over multiple generations, you'll see a shift in the types of traits that organisms have, and those will be adapted to that environment where they live. And he called this struggle for existence, where those that are better at surviving and reproducing end up having more offspring than the others. He called that natural selection. This is what's called Darwinian evolution or adaptive evolution. Is you have descent with modification acted upon by natural selection. It is a ridiculously simple concept. There was two big problems that stopped people from accepting this theory. One was that there was some religious tension with this. Especially initially, people felt like this process Darwin had come up with was replacing God in some way. Pretty quickly, in Darwin's time, religious people found ways to just sort of embrace evolution and pull it into their religious views. This is something that we call theological evolution, where they would just find ways to kind of mix the two. And God is the creator of everything. He's sustaining everything. So if there's this process, God is behind it. And that's how a lot of religious people in Darwin's time dealt with this. But it did cause quite a stir at first. And Darwin was terrified to publish his theory on some reports because he was worried that it would cause a faith crisis in the community. And his wife was concerned about that. She was very religious. Darwin was not, but she was. But by the time Darwin died, there was a lot of acceptance of this by religious folks. But it was very contentious at the start. The second thing that really stopped people from wanting to accept this is that living things are just so spectacularly complex. How could such a simple process create an eye? This is just a simplified version of an eye. And he even talks about that in his first book on it. He talks about the eye and he talks about the complications with it. And then he proposes a very rough sketch about how it could have evolved through this process. This here is someone who's introduced the complexity of biology to me in many ways. His photography is absolutely spectacular. You can see, I love this picture of him. He's taking a picture in this little bowl. I'm like, what could he be taking a picture in there? He's so intense about it that he's pushed his nose out of the way. He's so excited about what's in there, and it's this spider. And his photography, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you go onto his Flickr account, he just shows you how amazing, how spectacular biology is. And people in Darwin's time, they understood this. This was the great moment of naturalists, the rise of the naturalists, people who would study nature in depth, and they just took great awe in the complexity in the biological world. Just look at these spectacular beasts that are just all around us. And this was a big problem for a lot of people when they were trying to understand his theory. This is one of my favorite pictures that Schill took. This is a fly larva, so it's a maggot, and it's eating. This is a struggle for existence here, right? Captured. It's eating aphids, and those aphids are pretty defenseless. They're stuck to the plant that they're on. This one right here, I noticed when I was putting these slides together that there are 14 eggs and 14 healthy babies that hatched from those eggs. So that's an incredible success rate. But the real thing that I wanted to focus on here today to really point out how complex life is the stinger of a honeybee. I just published a video on this. How does the stinger work? Which you can find on YouTube. But this is a spectacular weapon. Bees are kind of special because it's only the queen who mates. The queen and the drones, the males who mate, they're the only ones that reproduce. And because of this, evolution can do some weird things. Evolution is all about survival and reproduction, but this is a suicidal weapon. The bee dies when she uses this weapon, but it's incredibly effective. And the reason that a trait like this can evolve in bees is because it's the queen that they're protecting. And these are sterile workers that do this suicidal defense mechanism. This is what happens after you get stung. There are muscles in the stinger. It detaches from the body. There are muscles in that keep pumping. There's little pumps you can see in the venom bulb at the bottom. It's the dark thing at the bottom. That's the venom bulb. You can see the pumps wiggling around in there. Up at top is the venom sac. That's filled with venom. That's getting sucked into that venom bulb and then pumped right into your skin. And it will keep doing that until it runs out, until the thing breaks. Usually it'll break before the venom runs out. But it will do that for a while until those muscles run out of power, until the thing jams. And that ensures that all of that venom gets in you. If you get stung by a wasp, they'll sting you, put in a little bit of venom, and they'll fly away. It's a much weaker defense because you're not nearly as affected by it. But when a bee stings you, a honeybee stings you, it's a lot more painful. You're getting a lot more venom. So this suicidal behavior, even though it ends up killing the bee, it ends up being a really good defense for the hive. And a lot of times you'll have lots of bees stinging you at once if you're near the hive and harassing the hive, so it's catastrophic for you. This is what the tip of the stinger looks like. It is spectacular. You've got these two barbed blades on the top, and then on the bottom you got the stylet. I call it a stabilizing rod. So that stabilizing rod is stabbed into you, and then these digging blades, they move back and forth, and they're attached to the same thing that's pumping those pumps. It is moving these blades, and this is what it looks like when it's going into your skin. It's a self-digging weapon. It's absolutely amazing. And it acts like a hypodermic needle. So these three parts together, they act as a needle, and the venom flows between them and squirts out the end there. So it delivers that all right into your flesh. Here's the entire thing. I wrote in an electron microscope that I've colored to look like my diagram here. So my diagram and the actual thing, I'm showing you the pumps inside the venom bulb. Those are attached to these rods that are also attached to the lancets, the digging blades. So when that muscle moves, it moves that one shaft, simultaneously moving the pumps and simultaneously moving the digging blades. So it digs and pumps as it goes. And then once that venom bulb hits your skin, it can't dig any further. So it just keeps moving, keeps tearing at your skin, and keeps injecting venom. Extremely effective. Here's a cross section of the stinger. So this is the shaft. It'd be like halfway through there. You might think when you look at this, why doesn't the venom squirt out between those two digging blades, between those two shafts? Well, we can see why this is. First off, on the bottom here, we see the thing it's on little runners. It's a tongue and groove system. And here we're looking at that without the without the digging blades on top of it. So you got a tongue and groove system. It's watertight, venom tight, you could say. And then on top you have these flaps that when there's venom in there and there's high pressure, those flaps end up pressing against each other and stopping the venom from leaking out. So those two rods can slide on top of each other without causing any spilling of the venom. This is absolutely spectacular. And the guy who first described this in detail is Snodgrass. This was 110 years ago, I want to say. And he wrote this about it. He says, "The whole apparatus, this constitutes an actual force pump in which the lobes of the lancets alternately act as a piston and as valves, because it's just the way that they're shaped. When they're being pulled up, the venom can flow past them. And when they're being pushed down, they fan out and they act as that piston." Very, very cool. Now, this was a little bit after Darwin's time that this study happened, but we already knew really complex structures in biology, the human heart, the human hand. Sir Richard Owen, he's the guy who coined the term dinosaur. He's also, I believe, he was in charge of starting the Natural History Museum in London, which became the model of natural history museums everywhere. I'm pretty sure that was him that did that. Very famous guy. He rejected evolution in place of an alternative that he called archetypal design. He was a big advocate of this. He said that the creator was creating using archetypes, and that's why it looks like there's common ancestry. That's an illusion. It's because of this archetypal design that God was using. And there was a bunch of other ideas that people proposed aside from evolution, and some of them were with evolution. So Lamarckism is a type of evolution that was not, so it was accepting common ancestry, but it was a different mechanism. It wasn't natural selection. It was animals were striving to survive in their environment, and then as you work out, you gain stronger muscles. And he thought that maybe there's a way that those stronger muscles would be passed through sperm to your offspring somehow. So there's a bunch of these different theories that were proposed even before Darwin's time, and then so Lamarckism was before Darwin, and then after Darwin published his book, there were a bunch of other different ideas about how it was that evolution took place, and this was really they couldn't accept the idea that such a simple process could produce such complex structures. In 1882 is when Darwin died, and by that time, common ancestry, the general idea of evolution, that things are related, animals are related to each other, that was accepted by the time he had died, but natural selection was nowhere close to being universally accepted in the scientific community. And of course, outside the scientific community, evolution was rejected by a lot of people for different reasons. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that natural selection became the mechanism that we finally understood to be causing the production of adaptations. Finally started to understand a little bit how genetics worked. We had a primitive understanding of genetics, Mendelian genetics at that time. We didn't understand DNA and all that, but we had enough of an understanding of how inheritance worked that we could model things mathematically. And when you run these equations, you find how powerful natural selection is. It is incredibly powerful, and it can do really incredible things. And we could test we could build these mathematical models, and then we could do experiments with breeding of animals, and we could do theory, much more specific theory than Darwin ever did. He just kind of described it in words, and then we could experiment with that and see if it actually worked the way that our math said it would. And there's lots of problems with it early on, and tinkering with it, getting in models and the experiments. We started to realize how powerful this was, and natural selection just became dominant. It's what's taught in every textbook as to how adaptations arise. It's through the process of descent with modification acted upon by natural selection. There are a bunch of modifications to Darwin's work, though. Everything listed here, when it was first discovered, people thought and people argued that this sort of topples Darwin, or it puts Darwin more into the margins, the natural selection thing. But as people studied these things and saw how they worked, it was realized that actually these are all just different ways in which natural selection plays out. So endosymbiosis is one here. That's when two organisms merge to form a new organism. That's what happened in our ancient ancestry with our cells have mitochondria in them that produce ATP for us. Those mitochondria used to be bacteria, but they merged with our cells back before we were multicelled organisms, long, long ago. They merged with our cells, and they became a new superorganism, is what it's called. And they've been evolving together ever since. it turns out, oh, this is just two organisms adapting to each other through a Darwinian process, through the natural selection. It turns out that this is actually just complex dynamics of natural selection playing out in a really messy system, really messy ecosystems. But these things have dramatically changed how we think about evolution since Darwin's time, which is why I'm bringing them up here. And then there have been a lot of new religious-based alternatives or proposals to natural selection as being this creative force. We have old Earth creationism, which takes a less literal interpretation of the Bible. They say, maybe the Earth is millions of years old, and some of this evolution stuff is legitimate, but they believe in a lot of intervention from God from time to time. Then you have young Earth creationism, which is a very strict, the Earth is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Everything was created in 6 days. If it looks like evolution, it was designed to look like that for some reason. Or sometimes some models, I have Hammonism on here. This is Ken Ham is the guy who has the Ark Encounter in the United States. And his version of creationism is so unique that I figured I needed a name. I don't know if that's the appropriate one, but he believes that there was actually hyper-evolution after the flood. So he actually does believe in common ancestry of a lot of organisms, but not going all the way back to the origin of life. And he thinks that humans are their own special creation and so on. There still is a lot of religious tension about this. A lot of people they feel like science is taking too much from the religious perspective. Intelligent design is kind of the newest branding of this. The Discovery Institute, which promotes this, they'll say that it's not a religious thing, but it's almost all of them are religious. Their religion is the thing that's motivating them to do this. Michael Behe is a biochemist, and he's the one who proposed irreducible complexity as an argument against evolution. He defines an irreducible complex system as a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts, remember that bee stinger, interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. So if we think about that bee stinger here, here's the diagram of the bee stinger. If you take away any of these, if you take away the venom, doesn't work. If you take away the venom sac, doesn't work. You take away the pumps, doesn't work. You take away the digging blades, even just one of them, doesn't work. This fits his description spot on. He goes on to say that an irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism, by slight successive modifications of a precursor system. And, evolution works by slightly modifying things, right? And he says that the reason you can't do this is because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Another way to say this using vocabulary, the vocab that's more common to evolutionary biologists would be that you cannot create an irreducibly complex structure through a single adaptive walk. An adaptive walk in biology is when something first starts to be selected for a new function, a new specific function. And a good example of this, these are chicken feet, and you can see that the chicken feet have some webbing between the toes. And if you look at a bunch of chicken, you'll notice that different individuals have more webbing or less webbing. There's variation here in any population of chickens. Then if you look at a duck's feet, you see that they have webbed feet, which are good for swimming. Well, chickens can swim. They actually can swim quite well. Not nearly as well as a duck. And it's pretty easy to imagine that if a population of chickens were in an environment where they had to swim to survive, or where that's how they got their food, you would start to see that all of the individuals in that population that happen to have the best webbing, they're going to end up getting more food, they're going to be healthier, and so they're going to pass on those traits to their offspring. There might be different genes already in that single population that can all affect webbing in a positive way, and all of those they're going to end up interbreeding with each other, and the ones that don't have good webbing are going to end up losing out in the evolutionary race here. And eventually you could get something like duck feet to evolve. It's not difficult to understand how this would work in a single adaptive walk. So that's what an adaptive walk is. He was saying that an irreducibly complex structure, it cannot evolve in a single adaptive walk. Funny thing is that this is an American coot. It also swims like a duck does. It has webbed feet, but it evolved webbed feet in a very different way. There's more than one way to skin a cat, which is one reason that evolution is so effective. There's always lots of different ways for something to happen. And so there's always lots of chances for something to happen in a population. And I just love that. It's so neat. But so far so good on irreducible complexity. I think this is a really neat concept. No one's ever spoken about this before that I know of. There's not another term for this, but it really is a neat concept. Like, there really are structures that cannot evolve in a single adaptive walk, and I think that's interesting, right? But his book goes on to say, an irreducibly complex biological system, if there is such a thing, would be a powerful challenge to Darwinian evolution. Since natural selection can only choose systems that are already working, then if a biological system cannot be produced gradually, it would have to arise as an integrated unit in one fell swoop for natural selection to have anything to act on. And this, I'm going to show, is where he goes off the rails. This is a pretty dramatic misunderstanding of how biology actually works in complex populations and in complex changing environments over time. And the reason for that is that the function of an organ can change over time, over evolutionary time. As environments change, as opportunities change, the function, the way that something is being used can change. And this can happen multiple times, causing multiple different, very different adaptive walks to happen on the same structure. And the end result can be something that never could have evolved in a single straight line. But this is just the complexity that is the real world. And for an example of this, here we have a leaf, and you can see it's got veins in the leaf. And those veins, what those are doing is they're allowing the transport of water and molecular nutrients to and from the leaf, back to the plant, and so forth. They've evolved under selection pressure to be this transport system. But in other plants, that's those same veins, if the margin of the leaf, if there's a mutation that causes the margin of the leaf to be reduced and expose some of that vein can dry out, and then when mammals come try to eat it, or large animals come try to eat that leaf, it pokes them and they don't like it. And so that's a new selective pressure. We have one system that has now evolved a completely new function. Those veins now act as a weapon. And in the case of the thistle here, they've evolved, apparently they've been under selection pressure to be a better and better weapon for a long time because they are extremely effective. They even deliver a little bit of the blood in there in the plant. They'll break off into your skin when you get stabbed by this. Has irritants in it that can really cause swelling and so on. So this is a very sophisticated weapon that has evolved here. And the term for this in modern times is exaptation. Darwin called this conversion. He actually wrote about it in his first book. He's incredibly insightful. He already wrote about this in his very first book, but exaptation is the word that we use for it now. It's when a trait or system starts being used for a second function, one for which it did not originally evolve. An exaptation can trigger a new adaptive walk. It doesn't always, but it can trigger a new adaptive walk. And here's a real life example of an exaptation. Birds shed their feathers, and this one found out that he can use his to scratch his own back, scratch his own neck. Now, will they eventually evolve feathers that are just for plucking and scratching their own necks? I don't know. Maybe if there was really nasty parasites that were bothering them, maybe there would actually be selection pressure for that. But right now, it's just kind of a convenience. They'll probably go nowhere. Another way to think about this stuff that Richard Dawkins, I believe he's the one who came up with this analogy, but it's the analogy of climbing Mount Improbable. So he said, imagine, this is the White Cliffs of Dover, imagine you're down at the bottom of the cliff looking up, and you see a frail, blind man at the top. How did he get there? It's a miracle. How did a frail, blind man get to the top of this mountain? You could say it's a miracle. You could say that some sort of powerful outside force had to bring him there. There's no way he climbed that mountain. Or you could say, maybe there's a backside path and this guy accidentally wandered up there. Maybe we should go help him. Most people are going to assume that there was some way that he got up there. Just some meandering, zigzagging pathway. And without intending to, he climbed this mountain and reached the top. The question is, when we look at the bee stinger, is there a meandering backside pathway that we can find in biology? The answer is, well, we're about to find out here. This is a grasshopper, and it has this bizarre, very creepy thing. A lot of people find that very disturbing. It's trying to dig a hole. It's doing that in asphalt. It's a little bit confused. It's not going to work. But it's trying to dig a hole with these scrapers on its rear end. And that structure is what we call an ovipositor. It's actually made of 6 little parts that are kind of tangled together, and it can move them with muscles that are attached to them. And when it uses those to dig a hole, and then it lays eggs in the ground. It's an ovipositor. Ovo as in egg, and positor as in depositor. So it's an egg depositor. That's what it looks like in grasshoppers. We don't know what the original ones would have looked like. The fossils of insects have not been studied enough for us to know that. But when you look at embryology, you can see that they start out as these kind of little nubs. There's 6 little nubs, and they end up getting closer together and longer, and then they intertangle, they intertwine, and they become this structure on the grasshopper. And so maybe the first ones were just 6 little hard nubs on the bottom of the animal that it was using to scrape the ground. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe they were 6 little hair-like things that would kind of guide the egg as it fell out, so it would kind of help aim where it's going to land. We don't know, but those are 2 very obvious possibilities, right? For a simple beginning of this structure. Here we have a katydid. That looks like a stinger, right? It's terrifying. When I found one of these when I was a little kid, I thought it was a stinger, and I threw it away, and I was terrified. And it's actually just the ovipositor. It's the same structure we just saw in the grasshopper. Here's the katydid using that. It's using it to dig a hole, and it's using a movement surprisingly similar to that bee stinger that we saw earlier. Foreshadowing. And it's using that to dig a hole, and it's going to lay its eggs. So its eggs actually go through that, into the ovipositor, go down that tube, and the back and forth motion roll the egg into that hole. And the inside of the ovipositor has these kind of little flaps, somewhat similar to the valves inside the bee stinger. Little flaps that can kind of catch that egg and push it as it's going down. They catch it and push it. There's also some fluid that comes out with those eggs that has antibiotic properties and things that make the egg bitter to predators that might want to eat those eggs. And so there's some fluids, but the glands that are producing those fluids are fairly small in a katydid, but all of that's coming out with these eggs. There's the egg, there's a little bit of fluid, and it's going through this ovipositor. So there's another little zigzag. Now, the ancestor of bees was not a cricket it was not a katydid or a grasshopper, but it shared a common ancestor with crickets and grasshoppers that already had an ovipositor. And so we can imagine that there might have been a pathway like this in the lineage that gave rise to bees. This is a sawfly. This is very closely related to bees. So there's sawflies, ants, bees, and wasps are all very closely related. Bees evolved from a group of wasps. Wasps evolved from a group of sawflies. And you can see its ovipositor here. She has a very interesting ovipositor. It's only the females that have these, by the way. The males don't have them. Hers has these little serrated edges on it, and she'll use hers to cut into plants and lay her eggs inside of those plants. So it's doing a lot more than that katydid one that was digging into the sand. This is what it looks like under an electron microscope. On top of it are 2 digging blades. We're only looking at one of them because we're looking at it from the side. But there's 2 digging blades, and then there is a stabilizing rod there that I've colored in green. We're starting to see some parallels here, right? And then we go to wood wasps, which are actually sawflies. They're misnamed. Wood wasps are sawflies. And its ovipositor is even more similar to that of a stinger. It's nearly identical to a stinger. It's just way bigger. And that can drill into solid wood. It's absolutely amazing. It's got these kind of, even on the stabilizing rod, it has these kind of ribs so that it will catch into the wood as the digging blades are moving. It catches into that wood and it just pulls itself deeper and deeper into the wood. And they also have the secretions that they have with their eggs are a lot more intense. They have huge sacs that are holding these secretions that come out with their eggs that help digest the wood, because the babies will eat this digested wood. And so she has inside of her body what biologists call a venom sac. It's a plant venom. It's for dissolving wood tissue, plant tissue. But it is very similar in structure to the venom sac in wasps and bees. And so we're finding all of these structures are starting to get more familiar here. So We've seen animals that can lay eggs in the dirt. We've seen animals that can lay eggs in plants. Here's an animal laying an egg inside of another animal. This is this little wasp. This company up here, they sell these wasps so you can put them in your greenhouse because they'll kill all the aphids for you. They lay their eggs one at a time inside aphids. Aphids are a great target if you're not a very good hunter, because the aphid is stuck to the plant. It's got its little kind of face stuck in there. It's drinking that plant blood, so you can just walk up to it and poke it. And it's not going to fight back much. It'll fight back a little, but you can poke it and insert your eggs, and that's what she's doing here. This is another wasp. She has venom so her venom glands, the molecules in there have evolved to be very potent at interacting with the nervous system of animals. So it can act as a defense weapon, and it can also act to paralyze a caterpillar, which she has done here. She's taken it back to her nest. She's going to lay eggs in it, and they will eat it from the inside out and hatch. And thus is the circle of life. Here's a really interesting one. This is a jeweled wasp. She's tackled a target that is way more difficult than an aphid, way more difficult than a caterpillar, something that's bigger than her. And what she does is she first starts by attacking it and stabbing its legs to paralyze its legs. Her venom also interacts with the nervous system. And once it can't fight her very well or run away, she carefully inserts her stinger into the brain, not injecting eggs, just injecting venom only into the brain. And then it's in kind of a stupor, and she can pull it around, and it kind of will use its own legs. It's almost like it's lobotomized, so it's just kind of do what you say. Not exactly. I mean, there's a struggle here, a little bit of a struggle, but she will walk that thing back to her nest, where it's carefully enclosed, and then she'll lay an egg in it that will hatch. And it's got plenty of food to eat when it hatches. And thus is the circle of life. So again, we've got animals now that are using their ovipositors for very, very different functions. And there's been selection pressure to adapt more and more effective venom at affecting the nervous system of animals. Now we're all the way to the point where wasps will actually use their ovipositors just as full-out hunting weapons. Most wasps actually they eat pollen and nectar and stuff when they're adults, but their larvae are carnivorous. So normally when they're hunting for their babies. I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm not familiar with the species, but I think she's actually just drinking some of the fluid, and then she's going to take pieces of meat back to her babies. I don't think she's actually eating the meat here, but I could be mistaken. But she has used her stinger and the venom in that to hunt. This is another caterpillar that she's killed on the spot, and she's dissecting it there. Here we have the ovipositor, the stinger of a wasp, an Abra wasp, next to the stinger of a bee. And you can see that they are nearly identical. The big difference is that the barbs, those backward-facing barbs, are a lot smaller in a wasp, and that allows them to stab you multiple times and pull out, and they can fly away. They just kill them, The downside of that is that they don't get nearly as much venom in you, but they get to live afterwards. That's the big difference. That's the thing that honeybees are not doing. They are sacrificing their life when they sting, those worker bees. Interestingly, the queen, being a female, she also has an ovipositor. It's a stinger, and the barbs on that are small. She can actually sting you and then pull it out with no problems. So the queen can actually survive a sting. But when we look at honeybees, we find, so this is a queen, the big one is a queen, the middle one is a male, and the small one is a worker bee. She's a female. The queen bee has a stinger, the worker bee has a stinger. The male bee does not have a stinger, because the stinger is, hopefully by now, you're all convinced, it is an ovipositor. That is how this irreducibly complex structure evolved. So here we have a winding pathway from a simple scraping structure all the way up to a stinger, using comparative anatomy of organisms that are closer and closer related to honeybees. So what have we learned? We have learned that the next time you get stung by a bee, you should remember this. You have been stabbed by the modified reproductive organ of a working girl. The second thing to remember is that irreducible complexity is not a problem for the process of Darwinian evolution. Descent with modification acted upon by natural selection can produce irreducibly complex structures. I open it up to questions.